November 18, 1944. Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The transport trucks rumbled through the gates of a hastily constructed compound on the outskirts of the main military installation. Inside sat 47 German women, their gray auxiliary uniforms torn and stained from weeks of transit across the Atlantic. They had been captured during the chaotic Allied advance through France and Belgium, plucked from retreating Wehrmacht units where they had served as radio operators, clerks, and medical assistants. Now they were prisoners of war on American soil, exhausted, hungry, and terrified of what awaited them. 23-year-old Greta Zimmerman pressed her face against the canvas covering of the truck, trying to catch glimpses of their new prison through the gaps. What she saw confused her. The buildings looked sturdy and well-maintained. American soldiers moved about their duties without the cruel expressions she had been taught to expect. Everything seemed almost ordinary, which made it somehow more frightening. The propaganda she had absorbed during her service with the Reich had painted Americans as barbaric enemies who showed no mercy to their captives. When the trucks finally stopped and the women were ordered out, they moved stiffly, their bodies aching from days of cramped transport. Captain Margaret Sullivan stood waiting for them, her uniform crisp despite the November chill. She was one of only 3 female officers assigned to oversee this unprecedented facility. The U.S. military had little experience handling female prisoners of war, and protocols were being invented as circumstances demanded. The women lined up as they had been trained, maintaining military bearing even in defeat. Captain Sullivan studied their faces, seeing fear masked by defiant pride. She had read their files during the previous week. Most were young, barely out of their teenage years. Many came from respectable middle-class families in cities like Hamburg, Munich, and Berlin. They had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing they were serving their country's defense, never imagining they would end up as prisoners on a continent thousands of miles from home. What happened next would become the defining moment that set this camp apart from every other POW facility in America. As the women stood at attention in the cold autumn air, a smell drifted across the compound from the mess hall. It was unmistakable, rich, and completely unexpected. Someone was roasting chicken. The aroma carried notes of butter, herbs, and vegetables cooking together in a way that reminded every woman of Sunday dinners from their childhoods, from a time before rationing and war had made such meals a distant memory. Greta felt her stomach clench with hunger. She had not smelled anything like this in over 2 years. The rations provided during their Atlantic crossing had been minimal, bland military provisions designed for survival rather than satisfaction. Before that, wartime Germany had meant increasingly scarce food supplies, with meat becoming a rare luxury reserved for special occasions. Yet here in an enemy prison camp, the scent of abundance filled the air. It made no sense. Everything they had been told suggested they would face starvation and abuse. Instead, their first impression of American captivity was the smell of a feast. The journey to this moment had begun 3 weeks earlier in a muddy field outside Metz, France. Greta had been stationed at a Wehrmacht communications post, part of the desperate German retreat as Allied forces pushed eastward. She remembered the chaos of that morning when American soldiers had surrounded their position. The male officers had fled during the night, leaving the auxiliary women to face capture alone. The Americans had seemed almost embarrassed to find them. Young GIs, who looked barely old enough to shave, had approached with rifles raised, then lowered them uncertainly when they saw only women emerging from the dugout with hands raised. One soldier, a farm boy from somewhere in the Midwest, had actually apologized as he directed them toward the holding area. That moment had planted the first seed of doubt about everything Greta had been taught. During their training with the Women's Auxiliary Corps, instructors had filled their heads with stories of American savagery. They were told that Americans showed no mercy to prisoners, that women captives faced unspeakable fates, that surrender meant torture and degradation. These warnings were meant to ensure loyalty and discouraged desertion. They had worked perfectly. Greta and her companions had lived in constant fear of what capture would bring. The reality had been disturbingly different. After their initial capture, they were processed through a displaced persons camp in France, where they received medical examinations, clean clothing, and regular meals. The food was plain but adequate, far better than what they had been eating during the final months of German retreat. American soldiers guarded them but maintained professional distance. There was no cruelty, no abuse, just bureaucratic efficiency as they were categorized and prepared for transport. The Atlantic crossing had been the worst part. Confined below decks on a Liberty ship, the women had battled seasickness and claustrophobia. But even there, American sailors had checked on them regularly, bringing water and crackers for those who could keep nothing else down. One medic had helped Greta when she developed a fever, administering aspirin and cool compresses without any hint of the malice she expected. 20-year-old Elsa Hoffman had spent the voyage composing letters in her mind to her mother in Dresden, letters she had no way to send. She tried to describe what she was experiencing, this strange disconnect between expectation and reality. How could she explain that their enemies were treating them better than their own officers had during the final, desperate months of retreat? How could she reconcile the propaganda with the farm boy who had apologized for taking her prisoner? Now, standing in this Massachusetts compound with the impossible smell of roasting chicken filling the air, the cognitive dissonance reached a breaking point. Greta glanced sideways at Elsa and saw her own confusion reflected in the younger woman's face. They had been prepared for brutality. They had steeled themselves for suffering. Instead, they were being confronted with something far more disturbing to their worldview: unexpected kindness and the promise of abundance. Captain Sullivan led the 47 women through the compound, pointing out the barracks that would house them, the washroom facilities, and the recreation area. The buildings were simple wooden structures, hastily constructed but solid against the New England winter that was approaching. Each woman was assigned a bunk, given 2 wool blankets, and provided with basic toiletries. The efficiency was impersonal but not unkind. Greta claimed a lower bunk near a window, wanting access to natural light and fresh air. She smoothed the blankets with hands that had grown rough from months of hard labor. The mattress was thin but clean, stuffed with straw that still smelled fresh. In the corner of the barracks, someone had placed a small pot-bellied stove that would provide heat during the cold months ahead. It was Spartan but far superior to the conditions they had endured during their retreat through France. The other women moved through the space quietly, speaking in hushed German. They were all performing the same mental calculations, comparing this reality with their expectations. Private Sarah Morrison, one of the American guards assigned to the barracks, stood near the door, watching them settle in. She was young, perhaps 25, with kind eyes and an expression of cautious sympathy. Greta noticed she did not carry her rifle with aggression, but rather with the awkward discomfort of someone unaccustomed to treating other women as enemies. As the afternoon wore on, the smell from the mess hall grew stronger. Greta's stomach cramped with hunger that had become a constant companion over the past year. Rationing in Germany had grown increasingly severe as the war turned against them. Meals had shrunk to meager portions of black bread, thin soup, and occasional potatoes. Meat had become a luxury reserved for frontline troops. The aroma drifting through the compound spoke of abundance that seemed almost obscene. At 1700 hours, the women were called to the mess hall for their first meal. They filed in silently, maintaining the military discipline that had been drilled into them. What they saw stopped several of them in their tracks. Long tables had been set with actual plates, not tin mess kits. There were cups for drinking and utensils that matched. But most shocking was what waited on those plates. Each woman received a portion of chicken, casserole that would have fed a family back home. Tender pieces of roasted chicken were mixed with carrots, peas, onions, and potatoes, all bound together in a creamy sauce and topped with a golden crust. Alongside it, sat fresh bread with butter, a small serving of canned peaches, and hot coffee with real sugar available for those who wanted it. Elsa sat frozen, staring at her plate with tears forming in her eyes. This was more food than she had seen in a single meal since before the war began. Around the mess hall, other women had similar reactions. Some cried openly, others simply stared in disbelief. Behind the serving line stood Dorothy Chen, the head cook of the facility. She was a second-generation Chinese-American woman from San Francisco, 42 years old, with strong, capable hands that had been preparing food since she was tall enough to reach her mother's kitchen counter. She watched the German women's reactions to the meal with an expression that mixed satisfaction with deep sadness. This was exactly the response she had anticipated, and the reason she had insisted on preparing this particular dish for their first night. Dorothy had argued with the camp administration about the menu. Standard procedure called for basic military rations for prisoners of war, adequate nutrition delivered efficiently and without luxury. But Dorothy had fought for something different. These were not soldiers who had carried rifles into battle. They were young women who had been caught up in circumstances beyond their control. And she believed that how America treated them in this moment would echo far beyond the walls of this compound. Her assistant, Helen Martinez, a young woman from New Mexico whose husband was fighting in the Pacific, had initially questioned the generosity. "Why should we feed them better than we feed ourselves?" she had asked. Dorothy's response had been simple but profound. "Because we can afford to, and because showing them American abundance is more powerful than any propaganda poster. Let them taste what freedom provides." The recipe Dorothy had chosen was her own creation, adapted from traditional American comfort food. She had started before dawn, roasting chickens until the skin turned golden and crispy, then shredding the meat by hand. The vegetables came from local farms, still fresh despite the late season. She had made the cream sauce from scratch, using real butter and milk, seasoning it with herbs from the small garden behind the mess hall. The entire preparation had taken hours of labor, but as she watched the prisoners' faces, she knew the effort had achieved its purpose. Greta lifted her fork with trembling hands and took her first bite. The flavors exploded across her tongue, rich, savory, comforting. It tasted like her grandmother's Sunday dinners in Hamburg, like celebrations and holidays, like everything the war had taken away. She had to stop herself from eating too quickly, knowing that her shrunken stomach would rebel if she consumed too much too fast after months of near starvation. Around the mess hall, 47 German women experienced the same moment of sensory memory and cognitive dissonance. They were prisoners of war, captured enemies of the American state. Yet, they were being fed like honored guests at a family gathering. The contradiction was overwhelming. Everything they had been told about American cruelty was being challenged by every bite of this impossibly generous meal. Dorothy Chen watched from the kitchen doorway, understanding that she was not just feeding hungry women. She was waging a different kind of war, one fought with kindness instead of bullets. The silence in the mess hall was broken only by the soft sounds of forks against plates and occasional quiet sobs. Greta ate slowly, savoring each bite while her mind struggled to process what was happening. This meal represented more calories than she had consumed in an entire day during the final months before her capture. The chicken was tender and seasoned with herbs she could not quite identify. The vegetables were cooked perfectly, still holding their shape but soft enough to melt in her mouth. Across the table, Elsa had stopped eating altogether. She sat with her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. An American guard approached, and Elsa flinched instinctively, expecting punishment for her emotional display. Instead, Private Morrison knelt beside her and spoke in gentle tones. "Are you all right? Do you need anything?" The kindness in her voice only made Elsa cry harder. Captain Sullivan moved through the mess hall, observing the reactions. She had been briefed on the psychological state of these prisoners. They had been indoctrinated to believe that Americans were savage enemies who would show them no mercy. This meal was designed to shatter that belief, and it was working more effectively than any amount of propaganda could have achieved. The women were experiencing a fundamental crack in their worldview, and Sullivan knew that such moments were when real transformation became possible. Dorothy emerged from the kitchen carrying additional servings. Several women looked at the extra food with expressions of pure disbelief. In Germany, asking for second helpings had become unthinkable as rations grew scarcer. Here, their captor was offering them more food than they could comfortably eat. Greta accepted another small portion, not because she was still hungry, but because she needed to confirm that this abundance was real and not some cruel illusion. The meal concluded with the canned peaches, a luxury that seemed almost decadent. Greta had not tasted fruit preserved in sweet syrup since before the war. The sugar alone represented more than a week's ration back home. She ate the peaches slowly, letting each piece dissolve on her tongue while she tried to understand what this generosity meant. Were the Americans trying to fatten them up for some darker purpose? Was this meal an exception, a single moment of abundance before they faced the starvation she had been promised? As the women filed out of the mess hall, they moved differently than when they had entered. Their shoulders were less rigid, their expressions softer. The meal had done something that military force could never accomplish. It had made them question everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Greta paused at the door and looked back at Dorothy, who was already beginning to clean the kitchen. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Greta saw something in the older woman's face that she had not expected to find in a prison camp. She saw compassion, dignity, and a quiet determination to treat them as human beings rather than defeated enemies. The next morning brought a breakfast that was simpler but still generous by wartime German standards. Fresh eggs scrambled with cheese, toast with butter and jam, hot oatmeal with brown sugar, and coffee that was actually strong enough to taste. The women ate in continued amazement, beginning to accept that the previous night's feast had not been an isolated incident. This was apparently how Americans fed even their prisoners. After breakfast, Captain Sullivan announced work assignments. The women would be expected to contribute to the camp's daily operations: laundry, cleaning, basic maintenance, and assisting in the kitchen. These were not punitive labor assignments, but rather the normal expectations of communal living. Several women, including Greta, requested permission to work in the kitchen. They wanted to be closer to the source of this miraculous food, and perhaps to understand the woman who prepared it. Dorothy accepted the volunteers with a knowing smile. She had expected this response. Food had always been her language for connection, and she understood that cooking together created bonds that transcended nationality and politics. She started the German women on simple tasks: peeling potatoes, washing vegetables, measuring ingredients. As they worked, she demonstrated techniques and occasionally corrected their methods with gentle guidance. Elsa found herself stationed next to Dorothy, chopping onions for the lunch stew. The older woman noticed her careful, precise cuts and nodded approval. "You have done this before," she observed in English. Elsa understood enough to respond in halting words. "My mother," she said, gesturing to indicate teaching. Dorothy smiled and replied, "My mother too." In that moment, despite the language barrier and the circumstances of war, they connected over the universal experience of learning to cook from the women who raised them. The kitchen became a space where the rigid boundaries between captor and captive began to blur. Dorothy sang while she worked, old Chinese melodies from her childhood that her mother had taught her. The German women hummed their own songs, traditional folk tunes from various regions of their homeland. Music and food created an atmosphere that felt less like a prison and more like a communal kitchen where women from different places had gathered to prepare meals together. During the lunch preparation, Dorothy taught Greta how to make American biscuits. She demonstrated the technique of cutting cold butter into flour, creating the flaky texture that made them rise properly. Greta watched intently, memorizing every step. This was knowledge she could carry with her, a skill that represented something beyond survival. It represented the possibility of creating abundance even in difficult circumstances. As the biscuits baked, filling the kitchen with their warm, yeasty aroma, Greta felt something she had not experienced in months. She felt useful, competent, and strangely hopeful about what each new day might bring in this unexpected place. 3 weeks after their arrival, the first letters from Germany reached the camp. The International Red Cross had been working to establish communication between prisoners of war and their families, and a packet of mail arrived bearing news from home. Captain Sullivan distributed the letters during the evening meal, calling out names in her careful pronunciation of German surnames. Only 14 of the 47 women received correspondence. The others sat in anxious silence, wondering if their families were alive to write, or if the letters were simply lost in the chaos of war. Greta tore open her envelope with shaking hands. The letter was from her younger sister Margaret, written in pencil on thin paper that spoke of shortages even for basic supplies. The words were carefully composed to pass censorship, but their meaning was clear enough. Hamburg had been devastated by Allied bombing. Their family home no longer existed. Their mother was living with an aunt in the countryside, struggling to find enough food to survive on the rations provided by the collapsing German state. Margaret herself was working in a munitions factory, receiving barely enough bread and turnip soup to sustain her through 12-hour shifts. The letter concluded with a question that pierced Greta's heart. "Are you getting enough to eat?" Margaret had asked. "We worry about you so much. Please tell us you are not starving." Greta looked down at her dinner plate, at the generous portion of beef stew with actual chunks of meat, at the fresh bread beside it, at the butter that was offered freely. She thought about her mother surviving on turnips while she, a prisoner of war, ate better than she had in years. The guilt was overwhelming. Around the mess hall, other women were having similar reactions to their letters. Elsa learned that her father had died in an air raid on Dresden. Anna Fischer discovered that her 2 brothers were missing, presumed dead on the Eastern Front. Katharina Braun read that her hometown of Cologne was now 70% rubble. Each letter brought news of death, destruction, and desperate hunger. The contrast between the suffering described in those thin pages and the abundance surrounding them in this American camp created a profound psychological dissonance. That evening, several women approached Dorothy in the kitchen. Greta served as their spokesperson, her English having improved through weeks of working alongside the American cook. "We do not understand," she said carefully, "why you feed us so well when our families are starving." Dorothy set down the pot she was washing and looked at the assembled women. Her expression was gentle but serious. "I feed you well," she replied, "because that is what Americans do. We believe that even enemies deserve dignity. What your government did to your people is not your fault. But what we do for you here, that is our choice, and it reflects who we are as a nation." Dorothy invited the German women to sit at the kitchen workbench after the evening cleanup was complete. This was unprecedented, a breaking of the formal boundaries that usually separated prisoners from staff. But Dorothy had been planning this conversation since the letters from Germany had arrived. She understood that these women needed context for the kindness they were receiving, and she was prepared to provide it through the most powerful tool she possessed, her own story. She began by telling them about her family's immigration from Guangdong province to San Francisco in 1907. Her parents had arrived with nothing but determination and the recipes her mother carried in her memory. They had faced discrimination and hardship, building a small restaurant in Chinatown through years of exhausting labor. Dorothy had grown up in that restaurant's kitchen, learning that food was more than sustenance. It was communication, culture, and connection. When the Depression hit, Dorothy's family had faced starvation themselves. The restaurant failed, and her father took whatever work he could find. Dorothy remembered the shame of standing in bread lines, the hollow feeling of going to bed hungry, the desperation of not knowing where the next meal would come from. But she also remembered the kindness of neighbors who shared what little they had, the church groups that organized soup kitchens, and the American ideal that no one should starve in a land of such abundance. She had learned to cook professionally during those years, taking jobs in various kitchens to help support her family. When the war began, she had volunteered for military service, believing that she could contribute something valuable. Her assignment to this POW camp had seemed unusual at first, but she quickly understood its significance. She was being given the opportunity to demonstrate American values through the most fundamental of human needs, the need to eat. Dorothy's voice grew softer as she shared the most personal part of her story. Her younger brother, Thomas, had enlisted in the army and was killed during the invasion of Italy in 1943. She had received the telegram while working at a military hospital in California. The grief had been devastating, threatening to fill her with hatred for all enemies, German, Italian, and Japanese alike. But she had made a conscious choice to channel that grief differently. "I cook for you," she told the assembled women, "because my brother would have wanted me to. He believed that America fought not out of hatred, but to defend values worth preserving. Kindness, generosity, the belief that all people deserve dignity. If I let his death make me cruel, then those values die with him. But if I can show you what America truly stands for, then maybe his sacrifice meant something." The kitchen fell silent except for quiet weeping. These women had expected many things from their captors, but not this. Not a story of loss transformed into deliberate compassion. The morning after Dorothy's confession, the dynamic in the kitchen shifted fundamentally. The German women no longer approached their work as assigned duties, but as a kind of apprenticeship. They wanted to learn not just how to prepare American food, but to understand the philosophy behind Dorothy's generous portions and careful seasoning. She welcomed their interest, recognizing that teaching was another form of bridge building between former enemies. Dorothy began with what she called the foundations of American cooking. She taught them how to make proper chicken stock from scratch, simmering bones and vegetables for hours until the liquid turned golden and rich. This stock would become the base for countless soups and gravies. She showed them the technique for frying chicken with a crispy coating, the secret ratios for fluffy pancakes, and the proper method for baking cornbread that was moist inside with crispy edges. Greta proved to be a natural student, absorbing techniques quickly and asking intelligent questions about why certain methods worked better than others. She learned that American cooking emphasized abundance and satisfaction rather than the precise economy that German wartime cooking had required. Where German recipes stretched scarce ingredients to feed many mouths, American recipes assumed plenty and focused on flavor and comfort. The language barrier created moments of comedy and connection. Dorothy demonstrated creaming butter and sugar by making exaggerated mixing motions. Elsa tried to explain a German baking technique using elaborate hand gestures that left everyone laughing. Private Morrison, who often lingered near the kitchen during her breaks, began serving as an informal translator, her own German improving through the constant exposure. One afternoon, Dorothy decided to teach the women how to make apple pie, calling it the most American of all desserts. She showed them how to create a flaky crust using the same butter cutting technique from the biscuits, but with different proportions. The women watched in amazement as she peeled and sliced what seemed like an extravagant amount of apples, tossing them with sugar, cinnamon, and a squeeze of lemon juice. As the pies baked, filling the kitchen with the scent of caramelizing fruit and buttery pastry, Dorothy shared the cultural significance of this dessert. In America, she explained through Morrison's translation, apple pie represents home, comfort, and the rewards of honest labor. It is what mothers bake for their families, what neighbors bring to new arrivals, what communities share at gatherings. Teaching you to make this is teaching you about American values. The finished pies were works of art, their crusts golden brown and flaky, their fillings bubbling through decorative vents cut in the top. Dorothy served generous slices to everyone in the camp that evening, prisoners and guards alike. The German women watched as Americans ate their handiwork with evident pleasure, offering compliments and asking for seconds. Katerina Brown, who had helped make the filling, felt a surge of pride that surprised her. She had created something that brought joy to others, including those who were technically her captors. That night, several women wrote letters home describing the recipes they were learning. They tried to explain how cooking had become a language of reconciliation, how kneading bread dough alongside American women had made them reconsider everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Late November brought an American holiday that the German women had never experienced. Captain Sullivan explained that Thanksgiving was a day when Americans gathered to express gratitude for abundance and blessings. The irony was not lost on the prisoners. They were being invited to celebrate abundance while their families starved in a devastated homeland. Yet the invitation was genuine, and refusing seemed both impossible and somehow wrong. Dorothy had been planning the Thanksgiving meal for weeks. She explained to her German assistants that this was the most important feast in the American calendar, more significant to many families than even Christmas. The traditional menu required days of preparation, and she enlisted the women's help with every aspect. Together, they would create a meal that embodied everything America represented to Dorothy: generosity, gratitude, and the belief that there was always enough to share. The preparations began 3 days before the holiday. Dorothy taught the women how to prepare turkey, a bird most of them had never encountered. She showed them the technique for making bread stuffing with celery, onions, and sage. They learned to mash potatoes with butter and cream until they were fluffy clouds of comfort. Green bean casserole, candied sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, and Parker House rolls rounded out the traditional offerings. Greta found herself assigned to pie-making duty alongside Elsa and Anna. They produced pumpkin pies, apple pies, and pecan pies in quantities that seemed almost sinful given what they knew about conditions in Germany. As Greta crimped the edges of yet another pie crust, she thought about her sister Margaret working in that munitions factory, surviving on turnip soup. The guilt threatened to overwhelm her until Dorothy noticed her distress. The older woman paused in her work and addressed all the German women in the kitchen. "I know this is difficult," she said through Morrison's translation. "I know it seems wrong to celebrate abundance when your families suffer. But refusing to acknowledge blessings does not create more food in Germany. It only wastes the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to understand what is possible when nations choose cooperation over conflict. Remember what you are learning here so that someday you can help rebuild your country with these same values of generosity." On Thanksgiving Day, the mess hall was transformed. Someone had found autumn decorations, and the tables were set with actual tablecloths instead of bare wood. American staff and German prisoners sat together, the usual segregation abandoned for this one meal. Captain Sullivan said a brief prayer of thanksgiving that acknowledged both the Americans present and the German families absent, asking for peace and healing for all affected by the war. The feast that followed was unlike anything the German women had experienced. Turkey carved into thick slices, stuffing rich with butter and herbs, potatoes whipped to creamy perfection, vegetables prepared with care and seasoning. The portions were enormous, and second helpings were encouraged. For dessert, the pies the women had helped create were served with fresh whipped cream. As Elsa took her first bite of pumpkin pie, she began to cry quietly. Private Morrison, sitting beside her, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It is okay to enjoy this," Morrison said softly. "Being grateful for what you have does not mean you have forgotten those who have less." December brought bitter cold to Massachusetts, and the approach of a holiday that carried profound emotional weight for everyone in the camp. Christmas had always been the most important celebration in German culture, and the women found themselves homesick for traditions they feared might never exist again. Meanwhile, American staff members faced their own grief, knowing that loved ones were fighting and dying in both Europe and the Pacific while they supervised a prison camp far from the action. Captain Sullivan decided that acknowledging the shared sadness might be healthier than pretending the holiday would be joyful. She gave permission for the German women to create decorations using whatever materials they could find. They folded paper into stars, carved simple ornaments from scraps of wood, and created garlands from pine branches gathered outside the compound. The results were humble but heartfelt, transforming the barracks into spaces that felt less like prison cells and more like temporary homes. Dorothy planned a Christmas Eve dinner that would honor both German and American traditions. She asked the women to teach her how to prepare some of their holiday foods. Greta shared her grandmother's recipe for Kartoffelsalat, a potato salad dressed with broth and vinegar rather than mayonnaise. Katerina contributed instructions for making rotkohl, the sweet and sour red cabbage that accompanied winter feasts. Anna described Lebkuchen, the spiced cookies that every German child anticipated. The kitchen became a space of cultural exchange as Dorothy adapted German recipes to available ingredients while teaching the women how to prepare American holiday dishes. They made a ham studded with cloves and glazed with brown sugar and mustard. They prepared green beans with almonds, scalloped potatoes, and Dorothy's special Christmas casserole that combined chicken, wild rice, mushrooms, and a cream sauce enriched with sherry. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall filled with music. The German women sang Stille Nacht in their native language, their voices harmonizing with practiced precision. Then they repeated it in English as Silent Night, their accents thick but their intention clear. American staff members responded with other carols, and soon the evening became an impromptu concert that transcended the boundaries of nationality and conflict. Before the meal was served, Captain Sullivan asked if anyone wished to speak. Private Morrison stood, her voice shaking slightly. She talked about her brother fighting in France, about her fear every time mail arrived, about how working with the German women had helped her see enemies as individuals rather than abstractions. Then Greta stood and spoke in her careful English about her sister in Hamburg, about the destruction of her childhood home, about her gratitude for the unexpected kindness she had found in captivity. The Christmas feast was consumed in an atmosphere of shared sorrow and fragile hope. The food was abundant and delicious, but it could not erase the war or bring back the dead or reunite separated families. What it could do, Dorothy believed, was demonstrate that even in darkness, humans could choose to treat each other with dignity and compassion. As the evening ended with coffee and Lebkuchen that the women had taught her to bake, she felt that her kitchen had achieved something more significant than full stomachs. January 1945 brought news that would fundamentally alter how the German women understood their own history. As Allied forces advanced deeper into German territory, American newspapers began publishing reports about the concentration camps being liberated. The stories were horrific, describing systematic murder on a scale that seemed impossible to comprehend. Photographs accompanied the articles, grainy images that showed mountains of emaciated corpses and survivors who looked more like skeletons than living human beings. Captain Sullivan faced a difficult decision about whether to allow the German prisoners access to these reports. After consulting with military psychologists, she decided that truth was necessary even when painful. The newspapers were made available in the camp library, and the women were free to read them or avoid them as they chose. Most chose to read, driven by a desperate need to know what had been done in the name of the country they had served. Greta sat in the library with a copy of the New York Times spread before her. The date was January 27th, and the headline described the liberation of Auschwitz by Soviet forces. The article detailed gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoria designed for industrial-scale murder, and experiments conducted on living prisoners. She read the words multiple times, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. This could not be real. This could not be something her country had done. Other women gathered around other newspapers, their faces reflecting the same horror and disbelief. These were not hardened Nazi ideologues, but ordinary young women who had joined auxiliary services believing they were defending their homeland from aggression. They had been taught that Germany fought for survival against enemies who wanted to destroy their nation. Now they were confronting evidence that their government had committed atrocities beyond anything they had imagined possible. Elsa found Greta in the library hours later, still sitting before the newspaper with tears streaming down her face. "What kind of country were we serving?" Elsa whispered in German. "What kind of people are we that this happened while we went about our duties and never questioned what we were part of?" The questions had no easy answers, and the women spent days grappling with their complicity, however unknowing, in something monstrous. Dorothy watched from a distance as the German women processed these revelations. She saw some withdraw into themselves, refusing to speak or eat. Others became almost frantic in their desire to understand, reading every article they could find and asking American staff members to explain how such things could have happened without ordinary Germans knowing. A few denied the reports entirely, insisting that they were Allied propaganda designed to justify the destruction of Germany. Captain Sullivan called a meeting to address the crisis of faith occurring among the prisoners. She spoke carefully, acknowledging their shock while refusing to minimize the reality of what had been discovered. "You cannot change what was done," she told them, "but you can choose what you do with this knowledge now. You can deny it and remain trapped in the lies you were told, or you can accept it and commit to being part of something better." That evening, several women approached Dorothy in the kitchen. They asked if they could work, needing the familiar rhythms of chopping and stirring to process their grief. Dorothy agreed, and they prepared dinner in near silence. Cooking had become their therapy, the physical act of creating nourishment providing comfort when words failed. As they moved through familiar tasks, they began the painful work of reconstructing their identities in light of truths they could no longer deny. The weeks following the concentration camp revelations transformed the German women's relationship with kitchen work. What had begun as assigned duties and evolved into cultural exchange now became something deeper and more personal. Working alongside Dorothy, preparing meals that nourished both prisoners and guards, offered a tangible way to contribute something positive to a world they now understood had been poisoned by evil they had unknowingly served. Greta threw herself into learning with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She arrived at the kitchen before dawn and stayed long after her assigned shift ended. Dorothy noticed but said nothing, understanding that some people processed trauma through work. Greta was teaching herself redemption, one meal at a time, believing that if she could master the art of feeding people with dignity and care, she might somehow balance the scales against the horrors committed in her country's name. The kitchen became a sanctuary where the women could focus on immediate, concrete tasks rather than drowning in guilt and confusion. Chopping vegetables required attention that left no room for dark thoughts. Kneading bread dough provided physical release for emotions too complicated to express in words. Stirring soup allowed for meditation on simple goodness in a world that had revealed itself to be far more complex and cruel than they had imagined. Dorothy began teaching more advanced techniques, recognizing that the women needed challenges to occupy their minds. She showed them how to make delicate pastries that required precision and patience. They learned to prepare sauces that demanded constant attention and perfect timing. Each new skill mastered represented a small victory, proof that they were capable of creating beauty and nourishment rather than only destruction and suffering. Anna discovered a particular talent for baking bread. She loved the alchemy of flour, water, yeast, and salt, transforming into something essential and comforting. Dorothy taught her the differences between various types of bread: soft sandwich loaves, crusty artisan rounds, sweet enriched doughs for special occasions. Anna practiced obsessively until she could produce consistent results, finding peace in the reliable transformation of ingredients into sustenance. The meals emerging from the kitchen took on new significance. Every plate served represented a small act of redemption, a demonstration that these women could contribute positively to their community despite their past associations. The American staff noticed the shift in attitude, commenting on the extra care evident in the food's presentation and the obvious pride the German women took in their work. Private Morrison observed to Captain Sullivan that the kitchen had become a kind of informal therapy program. "The women are processing their guilt through service," she said. "Dorothy has given them a way to contribute something meaningful." Sullivan agreed, noting that the transformation was remarkable. These women had arrived as defeated enemies and were becoming valued members of the camp community. Dorothy herself rarely spoke directly about redemption or forgiveness. Instead, she demonstrated through her own example how to transform grief and loss into acts of nourishment and care. Her brother's death had not hardened her into cruelty, but had deepened her commitment to treating all people with dignity. The German women watched and learned, understanding that redemption was not something granted through words, but earned through consistent actions over time. May 8, 1945 arrived with church bells ringing across America, victory in Europe. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, and the war on the European continent was over. In cities and towns throughout the United States, people celebrated in the streets, embracing strangers and weeping with relief. But in the prisoner of war camp outside Fort Devens, the atmosphere was complicated and somber. The 47 German women gathered in the mess hall to hear Captain Sullivan's announcement of Germany's surrender. They listened in silence as she described the terms of capitulation and the beginning of Allied occupation. For most Americans, this was a day of triumph and joy. For these women, it marked the complete destruction of everything they had once known. Their country was defeated, occupied, and, according to reports, largely reduced to rubble. Greta felt numb as she absorbed the news. Part of her had been expecting this outcome for months, but hearing it confirmed created a strange emptiness. What would become of them now? Would they be sent back to a homeland that no longer existed in any recognizable form? Would they face punishment for their service to a regime now revealed to have committed unspeakable crimes? The future had never seemed more uncertain. Dorothy prepared a subdued dinner that evening. She understood that celebration would be inappropriate in the presence of women whose entire world had just collapsed. Instead, she made comfort food: roasted chicken with herbs, mashed potatoes, green beans, and simple biscuits. The meal was generous but not festive, acknowledging that food could provide solace but could not erase the complexity of this moment. As the women ate in near silence, Private Morrison approached their table. She looked uncomfortable, but determined to speak. "I know this is a difficult day for you," she began carefully. "I want you to know that many of us here do not see you as enemies anymore. We see you as people caught up in something terrible, and we hope that whatever comes next treats you fairly." Several women nodded their thanks, too emotional to speak. The question of repatriation dominated conversations in the following days. Official word came that prisoner exchanges would begin soon, with German POWs being processed for return to occupied Germany. The women faced an agonizing choice: return to a devastated homeland where they might face retribution for their service, where families might be dead or scattered, where starvation and chaos awaited. Or somehow find a way to remain in America, where they had experienced unexpected kindness and discovered the possibility of redemption through honest work. Captain Sullivan called individual meetings with each woman to discuss their preferences and options. When Greta sat across from her, the captain asked directly what she wanted to do. Greta struggled to articulate feelings she barely understood herself. "In Germany, I have nothing left," she said slowly. "My home is destroyed, my family scattered. Here I have found purpose in the kitchen. I have learned skills that matter. I have been treated with more dignity as a prisoner than I was as a free citizen serving my own country." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Captain Sullivan made no promises but acknowledged that the situation was unprecedented. The military was still developing policies for handling female German prisoners, and there might be flexibility for those who wished to remain in the United States under appropriate supervision and sponsorship. The decision confronting the German women was more complex than simply choosing between two countries. It represented a choice between known suffering and uncertain possibility, between duty to a devastated homeland and the chance to build something new in a place that had shown them unexpected compassion. The stakes were profound, and the women agonized over what their choice would mean for their identities and futures. Letters from Germany painted an increasingly grim picture of conditions in the occupied zones. Margaret wrote to Greta describing chaos, hunger, and populations of displaced persons wandering through ruins searching for lost family members. Cities lacked basic infrastructure. Food supplies were critically short. The occupation authorities were struggling to prevent mass starvation. Everyone lived in fear of what winter would bring without adequate shelter or fuel for heating. Reading these letters in the mess hall, where abundant meals were served 3 times daily, created unbearable guilt for many women. How could they enjoy this plenty while their families suffered such deprivation? Yet returning meant leaving behind the skills they had learned, the purpose they had found, and the community that had formed around Dorothy's kitchen. It meant returning to a Germany they no longer recognized, serving a penance for crimes they had not committed but had unknowingly supported. Elsa approached Dorothy one afternoon while they were preparing bread dough. Speaking in her improved English, she asked a question that had been haunting her. "Is it cowardice to want to stay here rather than face what I left behind?" Dorothy paused in her kneading and considered the question carefully. "I think courage comes in many forms," she replied. "Sometimes it takes courage to return and face hard truths. But sometimes it takes equal courage to admit that you can serve better by staying and becoming an example of transformation." A group of 14 women, led by Greta, began meeting in the evenings to discuss the possibility of requesting permission to remain in the United States. They knew such a request would be unprecedented and possibly denied, but the alternative felt impossible to accept. They had found something in this camp that Germany could not offer them: the chance to rebuild their identities around contribution rather than compliance, around nourishment rather than destruction. Captain Sullivan reported their informal inquiries to her superiors in Washington. The response was bureaucratic uncertainty. No clear protocols existed for German women prisoners who wished to remain in America rather than accept repatriation. The War Department would need to consult with State Department officials, immigration authorities, and military lawyers to determine if such an arrangement was legally possible. While waiting for official word, the women continued their daily routines with heightened intensity. They worked in the kitchen with fierce dedication, as if proving their worthiness through the quality of meals they helped prepare. They studied English during evening hours, improving their language skills in case the opportunity to stay materialized. They wrote careful letters to the Red Cross, requesting help in locating surviving family members, knowing that any decision about their future required understanding what remained of their past. Dorothy watched these preparations with mixed emotions. She had grown fond of these women and appreciated their genuine transformation. But she also understood the difficult position America would face in allowing former enemy nationals to remain when so many American families had sacrificed loved ones to defeat Germany. While officials in Washington debated policy, life in the camp developed its own rhythms and rituals. Dorothy proposed establishing a weekly Sunday dinner tradition that would bring together the entire camp community, regardless of nationality or status. Captain Sullivan approved the idea, recognizing that such gatherings served important psychological purposes for everyone involved. The first Sunday dinner was scheduled for late May, 3 weeks after Victory in Europe Day. The German women threw themselves into preparations with enthusiasm that revealed how desperately they needed this sense of purpose and belonging. Greta organized a planning committee that met with Dorothy to design menus combining American and German culinary traditions. They would serve pot roast alongside sauerbraten, mashed potatoes with red cabbage, apple pie with strudel. The meals would honor both cultures, demonstrating that former enemies could find common ground around a shared table. The kitchen buzzed with activity for days before the first dinner. Anna perfected her bread making, producing dozens of rolls that emerged from the ovens, golden and fragrant. Katerina worked on desserts, creating delicate pastries that showcased techniques she had learned from both Dorothy and her own grandmother. Elsa managed vegetables, ensuring that every component was cooked properly and seasoned with care that reflected respect for the ingredients and the people who would consume them. Sunday afternoon arrived with unusual excitement permeating the compound. The mess hall had been decorated simply but thoughtfully with fresh flowers from the camp garden arranged in repurposed jars. Tables were set with the same care that families at home would use for special occasions. American staff members arrived in their dress uniforms rather than work fatigues, acknowledging the significance of the gathering. The meal began with Captain Sullivan offering a brief acknowledgement of what these dinners represented. "We gather today not as captors and captives," she said, "but as people who have learned to see each other's humanity despite the circumstances that brought us together. This food, prepared with such care by hands from both nations, reminds us that nourishment and dignity are universal needs that transcend conflict." The simple words captured something essential about what had happened in this camp over the past months. The dinner itself was a triumph of collaboration. Each dish reflected the combined efforts of American and German cooks working together, their recipes and techniques merging into something new. Conversation flowed more freely than it had in previous meals, with Private Morrison and other bilingual staff members facilitating exchanges between prisoners and guards. Laughter emerged, cautious at first but gradually more natural, as people discovered shared interests and common experiences despite their different backgrounds. Dorothy watched from the kitchen doorway as the community she had helped nurture through food enjoyed the fruits of their collective labor. This was what she had envisioned when she first insisted on preparing that generous chicken casserole for the newly arrived prisoners months earlier. She had believed that treating people with dignity and feeding them well could transform relationships, and the scene before her confirmed that belief. Former enemies were becoming something else, something that did not yet have a clear name, but felt like the beginning of genuine reconciliation. June brought official word regarding repatriation procedures. The War Department had established protocols for returning German prisoners to occupied zones in their homeland. Transport ships would begin departing from Boston Harbor in early July. The announcement forced decisions that the women had been postponing through weeks of hopeful uncertainty. They would need to choose their futures without knowing if alternatives to repatriation would ever materialize. Of the 47 women in the camp, 33 chose to return to Germany despite the hardships awaiting them. They made this decision from duty, from desperate hope that family members had survived, or from the belief that their country needed them during Reconstruction. These women had been transformed by their experience in American captivity, but they could not abandon their homeland in its darkest hour, regardless of what comforts America offered. The 14 women who still hoped to remain in the United States continued waiting for official permission that might never arrive. But regardless of what bureaucracy decided, all 47 women shared one determination. They would carry with them the recipes and techniques Dorothy had taught them. They would remember how food could be prepared with dignity and served with generosity. They would take these lessons back to a hungry Germany and use them to rebuild their shattered nation. Dorothy spent her final weeks with the departing women, teaching them recipes they could reproduce with whatever ingredients might be available in occupied Germany. She showed them how to make nutritious soup from bones and vegetable scraps. She taught them techniques for stretching small amounts of meat to feed many mouths. She demonstrated how to bake bread that remained edible for days, important knowledge for a place where fresh food would be scarce. But she also taught them her most cherished recipes, the ones requiring abundance that might not be possible immediately but could be prepared someday when Germany recovered. Her chicken casserole recipe was carefully copied into notebooks. Her biscuit technique was practiced until every woman could execute it perfectly. Her philosophy of generous portions and thoughtful seasoning was absorbed as something more than cooking instruction. It was a template for how to treat people with dignity even in difficult circumstances. The Sunday dinners continued through June, taking on bittersweet significance as farewell gatherings. Each week, different women shared stories about dishes from their German childhoods, teaching Dorothy and the American staff about their culinary heritage. Greta demonstrated her grandmother's method for making potato pancakes. Anna shared her mother's recipe for lentil soup. These exchanges created a repository of cultural knowledge that transcended the war and occupation. On the final Sunday before the first group departed, Dorothy prepared a special meal that incorporated every major dish the community had shared over the months. The table groaned with abundance: roasted meats, vegetable casseroles, fresh breads, and an array of desserts representing both American and German traditions. It was a feast of remembrance, a final celebration of what they had built together in this unexpected place, and a promise that the connections forged through shared meals would endure beyond barbed wire and national boundaries. 25 years later, in 1970, Greta Zimmermann stood in the kitchen of her small restaurant in Hamburg. The city had been rebuilt from the ruins she had returned to in 1945, rising from rubble to become a thriving port once again. Her restaurant, called Dorothy's Kitchen, in honor of the woman who had changed her life, served a unique menu combining American and German dishes prepared with the generous spirit she had learned as a prisoner of war. The establishment had become locally famous not just for its food but for the story behind it. Greta had returned to Germany with her carefully copied recipes and a determination to demonstrate that former enemies could become partners in building something better. She had spent years working in other kitchens, saving money, and perfecting her craft before opening her own place in 1962. The signature dish was chicken casserole, prepared exactly as Dorothy had taught her that first night in the Massachusetts camp. Generous portions of tender chicken, fresh vegetables, and creamy sauce topped with golden crust. Every plate served carried the memory of that transformative meal and the philosophy of dignity and abundance that had accompanied it. Regular customers knew the story and brought their children to hear about the American cook who had shown kindness to enemy prisoners. Elsa, now Dr. Elsa Hoffman, had taken a different path after returning to Germany. She had used her nursing skills learned from Dr. Hayes to work in hospitals serving displaced persons. Eventually, she had emigrated to the United States in 1953 through official channels, sponsored by the Henderson family who had befriended her during captivity. She now worked at a hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, not far from the camp that had changed her life. Anna had remained in America, one of the few who received special permission to stay under supervised immigration status. She had married an American veteran in 1948 and raised 3 children who grew up hearing stories about how their German mother had found redemption through learning to cook with their grandmother's friend, Dorothy. The family gathered every Sunday for dinners that honored the tradition established in that prison camp decades earlier. Dorothy herself had retired from military service in 1952, but continued cooking in various capacities until her death in 1968. She had maintained correspondence with many of the German women, receiving letters describing how they used the skills she taught them to feed their families and communities during Germany's reconstruction. She had watched with quiet satisfaction as former enemies built new lives incorporating the values of generosity and dignity she had tried to demonstrate through her kitchen. The story of the German women who thought chicken casserole was Sunday dinner had become more than personal history. It represented a larger truth about the power of small kindnesses to transform relationships between enemies. In a time when hatred seemed justified and cruelty expected, Dorothy had chosen to feed her prisoners as if they were honored guests. That choice had rippled outward, affecting not just those 47 women, but the communities they returned to and the families they would raise. The casserole that had seemed like an impossibly generous meal to starving prisoners had become a symbol of America's capacity for redemption and the enduring power of treating all people, even enemies, with fundamental human dignity.